This evening that if you missed last Sunday night, you missed an argument. Would you have wished you'd been here? Folks at home that are shut-ins, maybe you're wishing that we had live streamed that Sunday night. If there was a good argument, I'd like to have seen that and witnessed that. Now here's the interesting part. It did happen, but the argument happened in this pulpit between myself and myself. Now, those who were here remember that we were studying about angels for a little while Sunday night, and I came to 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, which talks about those angels that had fallen, and that we were going to discuss the fact that they have will and choice and they can make decisions. But my tired eyes couldn't convince myself that I was looking at 2 Peter 2 verse 4, as actually I was looking at 1 Peter 2 and verse 4 over and over again, and I stood here and argued myself out of the truth that 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4 was exactly where I wanted to be. I just couldn't convince my tired eyes that that was the case. And so you missed watching me banter back and forth in my own mind as I stood before you and had this discussion and finally just bailed on what I knew to be true. That 2 Peter 2 and verse 4 was exactly where we needed to be in that moment. And so it got me thinking this past week as I was thinking and studying about what I wanted to share with you this morning, about how easy it is sometimes in life that we can convince ourselves out of the truth, that we can know what's right, we know what God has said, we know what the Bible has revealed, we understand with clarity what truth is as it relates to some particular topic or issue or decision that we need to make, but we argue with ourselves to the point that we just convince ourselves away from the things that we know to be true. And so this morning, I want to share with you basically just 3 examples of that as we appreciate the fact that that can happen to anyone. And I want to begin here in this text that Gary just read for us a moment ago there out of Genesis chapter 3, because here's the first moment in human history where somebody knew what was true, they knew what was right, and were convinced otherwise, and made a decision and choice to do something other than what they knew to be true. And what I want us to simply appreciate is that when you're speaking about, and I put Eve and Adam in that order because she's the starting place in this process that we're talking about out of Genesis chapter 3, but here's this moment where she just tells the serpent, tells Satan exactly what the truth is. He says, we've been forbidden to eat of that tree that's in the midst of the garden, and God has told us not to taste it or to eat it or to touch it, to do anything with it, and if we do, we're going to die. And Satan very simply tells her, you'll not surely die. Certainly that can't be the case, right? Certainly that can't be the truth or the reality as it relates to this situation. I want you to notice, just remind yourself of what we just heard read to us in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 3. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said. Brother and friend, any time that you come into your minds where God has said, just trust it. And don't be convinced otherwise, and don't be tricked to think differently. If God has said, then it's truth. It needs to be relied upon and counted on and treated as such. God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. She knew the truth. She knew what was right. She understood what God's instructions were. This isn't misinformation. This isn't lack of knowledge. This isn't ignorance on her part. She knew what God had said. Verse 5. For God knows, after the serpent's response, you shall not surely die. And he gives her something else to think about. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You see, brother and friend, that's exactly what Satan does to us. When we know what truth is and we know what is right, and yet all Satan does is he gives us something else to think about. He tells us, well, maybe you should consider something different than what God has said. God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. God doesn't want you to be like Him. That's the only reason He told you to do that. You shall not surely die. God's just trying to hinder your ability to understand things like He understands them. God is simply trying to get you to behave in a certain way that He wants you to behave. He doesn't want you to have freedom and liberty. He doesn't want you to make your own choices. Sound familiar, by the way? Satan's been doing that since the days of Adam and Eve. He's been convincing people away from truth by simply giving them alternative things to think about, and then also offering them suggestions as to why it is God may have said that's a sin, or that shouldn't be done, or you should be doing this. And all the while, what we know to be true and what we know to be right is being whittled away by his methods. So she listens to what Satan says, and notice verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it looks pretty pleasant to eat. It was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. She took of its fruit, and she ate, and she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. And we don't have time this morning to address all the culpability and responsibilities as it relates to that situation this morning. That's not really our topic. I simply want us to appreciate that when you embrace truth, it requires us to look beyond the outward appearances of things. And sometimes Satan is going to present something and make it look more pleasant than it actually is. Generally speaking, sin doesn't present itself for the ugliness and the hardship that it's going to bring. Sin generally doesn't present itself in such a way that it would be readily and easily identifiable with something that is unpleasant. In fact, Satan does the exact opposite. He works very hard to make it look pleasant, even though God said this isn't going to be good for you. She looked upon that outward appearance, and then her pride begins to kick in, and she thinks, wow, God's keeping me from something. I think there's a lot of folks that have left their faith and have walked away from God because they've convinced themselves that God's rules, His instructions, His guidance, His counsel is hindering or keeping them from something. That there's something out there that's more desirable than what God has offered them. There's something that God isn't offering that they want, and so pride begins to kick in, and she decides, this is going to make me wise if I eat it. Why not? And so she convinces herself away from the truth, and she partakes of that which God had forbidden. She offers to her husband, and he's just as culpable. He chooses to eat as well. And you know the rest of the history. From Genesis chapter 3, folks have been being slowly and systematically, with Satan's efforts, being convinced away from what they know to be right and what they know to be true. And it would be wise for us to take caution from that and appreciate the warnings of folks like them when we know what truth has been revealed through the pages of God's Word and that we should be honoring it. Let me share with you a New Testament example. I want you to go over into the book of Acts, and let's look for a moment at the example of Saul of Tarsus. And what I want you to appreciate is what is recorded concerning him in verses 1 through 6 of Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9, begin with me reading in verse 1. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. Now, I want you to just simply note, as brutal as that sounds, but Saul was committed. He is determined that this is the right course of action. I should be, in his mind, he's telling himself the right course of action is to breathe out these threatenings and challenges against all those who are disciples of the Lord. He somehow convinced himself that that's the path he should be on. So much so that he goes and asks letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found anyone who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. And then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's kind of fascinating when you think about the question that's asked of him, and we know this is the Lord encountering Saul of Tarsus in this situation. But it's just a very kind of fair question. Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you doing this? His initial response in verse 5 is, well, who are you, Lord? And then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads or kick against the pricks. And I don't know a lot about farming and ox and those kinds of things, but the best understanding I have about this is that there were goads placed. If you were pulling a plow with a team of oxen or something, there would be goads. And if they would try to back up instead of going forward, they would be pricked by those goads, and it would remind them that they need to listen to the one in charge of the team and move in the direction that they lead them. What I want us to appreciate in the picture that is being drawn of Saul of Tarsus is that Jesus says, you are kicking against the goads. I believe he's saying, you know what is right. Why are you threatening my followers? Why do you continue to resist what you know to be true? You're an intelligent man. You've sat at the feet of Gamaliel. You know the history. You understand the law as well as any Pharisee. You can appreciate all the testimony that leads you to understand exactly who Jesus of Nazareth was. All the testimony necessary to draw the right conclusions is in front of you. Why are you resisting it, Paul? He begins to tremble in verse 6, and he's astonished. And says, Lord, what do you want me to do? And then the Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. It's amazing to me how some would willingly injure themselves rather than embracing understood truth. Paul, you'd rather hurt yourself by kicking against the goads. You'd rather injure yourself by resisting what you know to be true rather than just embrace it and gain the benefits that come from it. I wish I could get into my own mind sometimes when Satan convinces me that this is the path that you ought to choose, even though I know what's right. So much so that he convinces me to breathe out threatenings and challenges and create harmful situations and all the difficulties of that. And Saul of Tarsus, though he knew what was true, and I think is also evidenced by his rapid change, and yet all the while he was breathing out threatenings and harm and challenge to any and every disciple and follower of Jesus. So much so that he even went and got letters that he'd have permission to drag them all back to Jerusalem, even though the truth was before him the entire time. But let me go back to the Old Testament with you to one more example. And I'm going to spend a little more time maybe on this one. Maybe I shouldn't have told you that. But I'm not going to read to you all of Numbers chapter 22, but I want to spend some time here because there is a great illustration of what we're talking about this morning in this text. And how easy it is sometimes for us to be persuaded away from we know what is to be true. Because here's the example of Balaam, who resists the clear instructions that come from God. So Balaam is asked from those Moabites. And so we're fast forward a little bit because of time. But read with me verse 5. Let's start there. Then he sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river in the land of the sons of his people, to call him, saying, Look, a people has come from Egypt. See, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. That's God's people. And they're settling, preparing the time for the conquest. So here's this people settling. Therefore, please come at once and curse this people for me. For they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. So Balaam is known as somebody, if he curses somebody, they're cursed. If he blesses them, they're blessed. And they send for him to go and curse God's people. We're beginning to settle in the region. But notice what God tells him to do as it relates to this request. In verse 12, he said, God says to Balaam, you shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. It's an interesting thought for a moment, right? He tells Balaam, listen, God tells him, don't go and even think about going over there and cursing the people, because I've already blessed them. My blessing is already upon them. I have already chosen to honor them and to care for them. They're already blessed by me, and so there'd be no purpose or reason for you to go do that. So Balaam rose in the morning, verse 13, and said to the princes of Balak, "Go back to your land, for the Lord has refused to give me permission to go with you. You all going back home, because I've heard from the Lord Himself, and He's told me that I am not to go with you, and I'm absolutely not to curse those people." God's word, His truth, what is right, has been spoken. But here's where the challenges begin to come. As Balak refuses to take no for an answer, he continues to have conversations as it relates to trying to convince Balaam differently. And so verse 17, "For I will certainly honor you greatly, and I will do whatever you say to me. Therefore, please come curse this people for me." And then Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, "Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more." And so Balak decides, I need to sweeten the pot. I need to give him more. I've got to do something in order to get him to change his disposition about this. And Balaam basically says, listen, you could give me all the gold and silver in your place. It's not going to change. The word of the Lord has spoken. I can't resist what God has instructed me to do. But here's where the problem comes in. Notice verse 19. Remember the first time what he said? The first time they came and he knew what was right, he says to them, "Go home. God has blessed those people. I can't curse them. Y'all go home." Verse 19, "Now therefore please you also stay here tonight, that I may know what more the Lord will say to me." The Lord's been pretty plain. The Lord's instructions have been pretty clear. The people have already been blessed by the hands of God. Balaam should not be even considering cursing them. God's instructions have been with great clarity as to exactly what He wants Balaam to do and not do in this situation. But Balaam's holding out some hope. If you guys just hang out for tonight, not like he said the first time, go home. This time, stay a little while longer. Let me see whether or not maybe God will change His mind and change what the truth is as it relates to this situation. Well, friends, can I ask you this? What's left to say? Will the people of Israel all of a sudden no longer be considered blessed in the eyes of God? Will all of a sudden this nation of people that He has led clear out of Egypt and went all of those challenges and difficulties to get them there, and He's brought them to this point in the process, and now all of a sudden, one night later or some time later, He's going to no longer desire to bless them? I believe sometimes we convince ourselves out of what truth and right is by simply just overthinking it. And keep hoping that maybe God will give us something different. Maybe God will tell us something different. Maybe God's instructions will change. Maybe somehow. Now, I'm not suggesting that you and I can't get better clarity as time goes on. I'm not suggesting that we might not misunderstand something in our life that we have to correct at some later time in our life. But there are some very basic, foundational, understood truths that you and I should be careful not to have a persuasive conversation concerning whether it's true or not. The instructions that had come were consistent and clear. And so he tells in verse 20, as he asks them to wait a little while longer, wait tonight. So God does come to Balaam in the night in verse 20, and He says to him, "If the men come to call you, rise and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you, that you shall do." Here's my conviction about what's happening in that text. God says to him, listen, they may come back to you again after they've spent the night, and they're going to ask you once more to come and to curse the people and to come with them. Make your choice. God's not forcing Balaam to do the right thing here. He's reminding him of the right thing. That's the end of the verse, right? The end of the verse is, remember what I said. Remember what I said. You can choose. I'm not forcing you not to go with them. And if they come to you and say, hey, come on, rise up and go. But you need to remember what I've instructed you, Balaam. And only, but only the word which I speak to you. That you should do. There may be all kinds of folks that come into our lives sometimes and try to convince us of anything and everything but the truth about something. And they may have great tactics. They may offer all kinds of things. They may dangle that fruit in front of us and tell us, listen, it's pleasant to the eyes. It's going to be great to the taste. It's going to make you wise. Your pride kicks in and you give in like Adam and Eve did. Maybe it'll be like Saul of Tarsus, who listens to all those around him in positions of authority among the Jews, and he's convinced that I've got to do all things troublesome to anyone who is a disciple and follower of Jesus, even though I'm familiar enough with the narrative of the Old Testament law to know that that's exactly who the Old Testament law was pointing to. And I can be like Balaam, who understands clearly what the basic, foundational, simple instructions of the Lord are. You're not supposed to go and to curse those people, even though they entice you once again and again. Even though they may sweeten the pot, even though they make it look even better than it ever looked before. Choose wisely. And so verse 21 tells us that so Balaam rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. Now I've heard a couple of different thoughts about this, and it's interesting to think about what happens here in this moment. And there might be some truth to the idea that part of Balaam's problem isn't just that he went. But verse 20 says, if they come and ask you again, make your choice. But it appears in verse 21, he doesn't even wait for them to come. He's thinking about the benefits. He's thinking about the reward they're going to offer. He's thinking about the temptation of the gold and the silver and the benefits that the Moabites are going to offer him. And he gets up in the morning without even being asked and runs towards the very thing that God had told him not to do. And then you remember the rest, right? He has a conversation with his donkey. He has to be reminded of what God's instructions really were. Reminded of what the truth of what God really wanted from him should be. And I ask all of us this morning, friends, how many times have we been convinced away from very clear, simple instructions from God's Word? And they're not hard to understand. We're not talking about some challenging text. We're not talking about trying to understand the exactness of every symbol within the book of Revelation. We're not trying to say that I'm going to grasp every picture and every dream that Ezekiel had in all of the book of Ezekiel. But friends, what I'm trying to suggest to us this morning is there are some very basic, simple, understandable principles within God's Word that on an everyday basis, Satan is trying to convince us that that isn't true anymore. And he's trying to persuade us away. That what God has always called sinful is somehow no longer sinful. What God has always said is right is somehow no longer right. What God has always chosen as the path that we should be on. So rather than arguing with ourselves, and having this debate in our minds. Will I pursue what God has said is right? Will I pursue the word that He offers unto me? Or will I pursue the temptations and the offerings that come from Satan? I want to share with you two quick texts out of the New Testament, and the lesson will be yours. But I want you to notice in 2 Peter chapter 2, and it better be right this time. But in 2 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 15, many generations later, guess who they're still talking about? They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. It kind of tells us what was going on in the mind of Balaam when he decides to get up that early in the morning and get his donkey and head on over to the Moabites. He loved the wages of unrighteousness. And brethren and friend, do not ever convince yourself that Satan won't pay it. He will pay whatever it is you're desiring in this world to get you away from God. He'll pay it. But Balaam was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. It should be considered maddening that someone would ignore what God has said and turn to anything other than the truth that's been revealed. Notice verse 11 of the book of Jude. When he pronounces a woe, he says, "Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah." What I appreciate about that is that I'm going to assume that apparently the story of Balaam had been being shared over and over and over again. They picked, when he's trying to give them a reference, when Peter's trying to give them a reference of what he's talking about, he points to something that they would be familiar with. He points to Balaam and his decision to abandon what was truth and pursue unrighteousness. When Jude writes his letter, he does the very same thing. He apparently has pointed to something that they were highly familiar with, and I suppose that an account that has a man being instructed by a beast would probably be something you'd tell over and over again. But the lesson of Balaam isn't that he had a conversation with the donkey. The message of Balaam is, when you understand what is right, when you understand the truth of God, do it. And don't be convinced otherwise. Be resolved to do it. And don't let anything persuade you, convince you, trick you, subtly lead you away. When the truth of God's Word has been presented, do it. Honor it. And be resolved to do such. Can we invite you to consider that this morning? To be convinced of what God has said is true and do it. Be resolved to follow it. And don't let all the persuasive methods and thoughts and subtleties of the world and Satan's messengers to convince us otherwise. Trust what is true in the pages of God's Word. Trust that Jesus said, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned." Trust that Saul of Tarsus, finally, when he was convinced to follow the path of truth and was told, "Saul, Saul, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, washing away thy sins, calling upon the name of the Lord." That's what he did. It's time for us to be restored back into relationship. And God teaches us to pray for that forgiveness and cleansing. Then let's just do what God has instructed us. Be convinced of what is right, follow it, and don't let anything persuade us away from God's truth. And if we could help you in giving your life and resolving yourself to those spiritual things this morning, won't you come? while we stand and while we sing.